Karoline Leavitt lived a quiet life in a small town tucked away in the rolling hills of New Hampshire. She wasn't someone you'd expect to see on TV or hear about in the news. By day, she worked as a librarian at the local community library, surrounded by towering shelves of books and the faint smell of old paper. Her job was simple but fulfilling, helping kids find their next favorite storybook or guiding adults through research projects they needed for work or school. But when the clock struck 5 and she hung up her cardigan for the day, Karoline transformed into something else entirely. A blogger with a knack for breaking down complicated topics into bite-sized pieces anyone could understand. Her blog started out as just a hobby, a place where she could vent her thoughts after long days sorting through dusty encyclopedias and returning misplaced novels to their rightful spots. At first, it was mostly random musings about life in her sleepy little town. But over time, Karoline found herself drawn to writing about bigger issues, things like politics, economics, and global events. What made her stand out wasn't just her ability to simplify these heavy subjects. It was her humor. She had a way of making even the driest topics funny, using clever metaphors and relatable examples that left readers nodding along and chuckling to themselves. One evening, while sipping chamomile tea at her kitchen table, Karoline decided to tackle a topic she'd been thinking about for weeks: global economic policies. It wasn't exactly light reading material, but she figured if she could explain it in a way that didn't put people to sleep, maybe it would resonate with her audience. So she sat down at her laptop and began typing. She joked about how inflation felt like trying to buy groceries with Monopoly money, and compared government bailouts to giving your misbehaving kid an extra cookie instead of taking it away. By the time she hit publish, she felt satisfied, but she never expected what came next. Within hours, her post blew up. People were sharing it all over social media, praising her sharp wit and spot-on observations. Comments poured in from strangers saying things like, "Finally, someone explained this in a way I can actually understand." Even some economists chimed in, admitting her analogies weren't far off the mark. For Karoline, it was surreal. She'd always dreamed of reaching a wider audience, but she never imagined her words would strike such a chord. Still, nothing could have prepared her for the email that arrived 2 days later. It was late afternoon when Karoline noticed the notification blinking on her phone. Curious, she opened it and froze. The subject line read, "Invitation to appear on Jimmy Kimmel Live." At first, she thought it was spam. Who would want her, a small-town librarian with no TV experience, to appear on national television? But as she scrolled through the message, her disbelief turned into excitement. The producers loved her blog post and wanted her to come on the show to talk about her unique take on global economic policies. They even mentioned that another guest scheduled for the same episode was none other than Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and current Prime Minister of Canada. Karoline's heart raced. Was this really happening? She pinched herself to make sure she wasn't dreaming. After exchanging a few emails to confirm the details, reality set in. This wasn't just a fluke, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As thrilled as she was, though, nerves quickly bubbled up. Sure, she was comfortable behind a keyboard, crafting witty posts from the safety of her home, but going live in front of millions of viewers, that was a whole different ballgame. The days leading up to the show were a blur of preparation. Karoline spent hours poring over articles and videos about Carney, determined to familiarize herself with his career and policies. She wanted to be ready for anything, knowing full well that discussing economics with someone of his stature wouldn't be easy. Friends and family tried to calm her nerves, reminding her of her natural talent for explaining complex ideas in relatable ways. "Just be yourself," they told her. "You've got this." But deep down, Karoline couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into uncharted territory. What if she stumbled over her words? What if she accidentally offended someone? These questions swirled in her mind as she packed her bags and boarded a plane to Los Angeles. Sitting in her seat, staring out the window at the clouds below, she reminded herself why she was doing this. This wasn't just about her. It was about showing people that ordinary voices mattered. And if she could bring a little clarity and maybe a laugh or two to a confusing topic, then it would all be worth it. As the plane descended into LAX, Karoline took a deep breath. She didn't know what awaited her on that stage, but one thing was certain. Her life was about to change, forever. The moment Karoline stepped off the plane in Los Angeles, she felt like she'd landed on another planet. The city buzzed with energy, cars honking, palm trees swaying, and people rushing past her like they were all late for something important. It was a far cry from the calm, predictable rhythm of her small New Hampshire town. As she grabbed her suitcase and made her way to the taxi stand, she couldn't help but feel both excited and overwhelmed. This was her first time in LA, and everything seemed bigger, brighter, and louder than she'd imagined. Her hotel room offered a brief reprieve from the chaos outside. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cozy space with a comfortable bed and a small desk, but it gave her a chance to catch her breath. After unpacking her things, Karoline sat down at the desk and opened her laptop. She had already done plenty of research before leaving home, but now that the big day was getting closer, she wanted to make sure she was as prepared as possible. Scrolling through articles and videos about Mark Carney, she jotted down notes in her trusty notebook, circling key points she didn't want to forget. One thing kept nagging at her. How could she hold her own against someone so accomplished? Mark Carney wasn't just any politician. He was a global figure who had spent years shaping economic policies that affected millions of lives. He spoke confidently, used technical terms effortlessly, and carried himself with an air of authority that intimidated even seasoned experts. Meanwhile, here she was, a librarian who wrote blog posts in her pajamas after work. The gap between them felt enormous, and it made her question whether she belonged on the same stage. To shake off those doubts, Karoline decided to focus on what she did best, making complex ideas accessible. She reminded herself that not everyone watching the show would know or care about the intricacies of monetary policy or fiscal reform. Most viewers tuned in for entertainment, not a lecture. Her job wasn't to outsmart Mark Carney. It was to offer a fresh perspective, one that resonated with everyday people who might otherwise tune out during discussions about economics. With that mindset, she began practicing how to articulate her thoughts clearly and concisely. She rehearsed, jokes about inflation being like trying to stretch your paycheck like leftover pizza dough, and compared government bailouts to giving kids extra dessert when they misbehaved. Each analogy brought a smile to her face, and slowly, her confidence started to grow. The next morning, she woke up early and headed to the studio for a quick run-through. The building was massive, with bustling hallways filled with crew members carrying equipment and shouting instructions. A friendly producer greeted her and walked her through the schedule for the evening. They explained where she'd sit, how the cameras worked, and what to expect during the segment. Despite their reassurances, Karoline's stomach churned with nerves. What if she froze under the bright lights? What if her jokes fell flat? She pushed those thoughts aside and focused on soaking up every detail. Later that afternoon, she met Jimmy Kimmel briefly before the taping. He was warm and welcoming, cracking a few jokes to put her at ease. "Don't worry," he said with a grin. "We're just here to have fun. If you mess up, we'll edit it out, or blame it on me." His words helped calm her racing mind, and she found herself laughing along with him. When she mentioned her nervousness about sharing the stage with Mark Carney, Jimmy chuckled. "Oh, don't let him scare you," he said. "He's human too. Just remember, you've got the audience on your side." As the hours ticked by, Karoline tried to stay relaxed. She wandered around the studio, chatting with staff members and admiring the vibrant set design. Backstage, she ran into other guests, scheduled to appear on the show, including a popular comedian and a musician promoting their new album. Everyone seemed friendly and approachable, which helped ease some of her anxiety. Still, the thought of facing Mark Carney loomed large in her mind. She glanced at her phone and saw messages from friends and family back home, cheering her on and reminding her to enjoy the experience. Their support meant the world to her, and she promised herself she wouldn't let fear overshadow the incredible opportunity she'd been given. When it was finally time to get ready for the taping, Karoline slipped into the outfit she'd carefully chosen days earlier. a simple yet elegant dress that struck the perfect balance between professional and approachable. As she stood in front of the mirror applying a touch of makeup, she took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "You've got this." Her reflection stared back at her, looking more determined than scared. For the first time since arriving in LA, she felt ready, not just to survive the show but to embrace whatever came her way. Backstage, the atmosphere shifted as the countdown to airtime began. Crew members scrambled to finalize last-minute details while the host warmed up the live audience with playful banter. Karoline listened intently from behind the curtain, hearing the roar of laughter and applause echo through the studio. It was surreal to think that in just a few minutes, she'd step onto that stage and join the action. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds wash over her. No matter what happened next, she knew this was a moment she'd never forget. The moment arrived faster than Karoline expected. 1 second, she was standing backstage, clutching her notes and trying to steady her breathing, and the next, a stagehand was signaling for her to get ready. The muffled sounds of Jimmy Kimmel's opening monologue filtered through the curtain, punctuated by bursts of laughter from the audience. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure everyone around her could hear it. "You're up next," whispered the stage manager, with an encouraging smile. Karoline nodded, though her legs felt like jelly as she took her place just out of sight. Then came the cue. "Please welcome Karoline Leavitt." The crowd erupted into applause, and before she knew it, she was walking onto the brightly lit stage. The glare of the spotlights made it hard to see anything beyond the first row of seats, but she could feel the energy radiating from the audience. Smiling nervously, she waved and made her way to the couch where Jimmy Kimmel sat grinning at her. "Welcome, welcome," he said, motioning for her to sit down. His tone was warm and inviting, instantly putting her at ease. As she settled into the plush chair, Jimmy launched into a playful introduction. "Folks, this is Karoline Leavitt, a librarian by day and apparently an economist by night. She writes this hilarious blog that breaks down big, scary topics like global economics in a way even I can understand." The crowd laughed, and Karoline found herself relaxing just a little. Jimmy wasted no time diving into questions about her viral post. "So, let me get this straight. You compared inflation to stretching pizza dough? That's genius." He leaned back, gesturing dramatically as if imagining the scenario himself. "Tell us more about that." Karoline chuckled, grateful for his lighthearted approach. "Well, yeah," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "Think about it. When prices go up, your money doesn't stretch as far as it used to. It's kind of like when you try to make one slice of pizza feed 2 people. It gets thinner and thinner until there's almost nothing left." The analogy drew another round of laughter from the audience, and Jimmy nodded approvingly. "That makes perfect sense," he said. "I wish my high school econ teacher had explained it like that. Maybe I wouldn't have fallen asleep every class." More laughs followed, and Karoline felt her confidence growing. For the next few minutes, they chatted about her blog, her quirky sense of humor, and how she managed to turn dry topics into entertaining reads. Jimmy kept the conversation flowing effortlessly, tossing in jokes and compliments that kept both Karoline and the audience engaged. Just as things were hitting their stride, the stage manager signaled for the next guest to join them. Karoline's stomach did a flip when she saw who it was. Mark Carney, stepping onto the stage with the poise of someone who'd spent decades commanding rooms much larger than this one. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he exuded authority, shaking hands with Jimmy before taking his seat beside Karoline. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker, her casual charm versus his polished demeanor, but the audience seemed thrilled to see them together. "Wow, we've got quite the lineup tonight," Jimmy quipped, gesturing between the 2 guests. "On one side, we've got Karoline, our accidental economist, and on the other, we've got Mark Carney, the actual economist. Let's see who wins this round." The joke earned another wave of applause, though Karoline noticed. Mark's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. She wondered if he was feeling as uneasy as she had been earlier, or if he simply didn't appreciate sharing the spotlight with someone like her. Jimmy turned his attention to Mark first, asking him about recent policy decisions and economic Trends. Mark responded with practiced eloquence, using terms like quantitative easing and monetary stimulus that sounded impressive, but left most of the audience nodding politely without fully understanding. Karoline listened intently, jotting down mental notes about points she might address later. When Jimmy finally pivoted to her for input, she seized the opportunity. "Well," she started, leaning forward slightly, "I think what Mark is saying here is really important. But I also wonder if regular folks are seeing those benefits in their daily lives. Like, does all this fancy financial jargon translate to cheaper groceries or lower rent?" The question hung in the air for a beat, and the audience murmured in agreement. Karoline pressed on, adding a touch of humor. "Because honestly, most of us aren't sitting around thinking about monetary policy, we're just hoping our paycheck lasts until Friday." Her comment sparked a ripple of laughter, and Jimmy chimed in. "That's true. Nobody's breaking out spreadsheets over breakfast unless they're secretly plotting world domination." Even Mark cracked a faint smile, though his expression remained guarded. Sensing an opening, Karoline continued, weaving in some of the analogies she'd prepared. Take government bailouts, for example. Sometimes it feels like handing extra cookies to the kid who already ate all the cake, while the rest of us are still waiting for dessert. This time the audience roared with approval, clearly enjoying her take. But Karoline noticed something shift in Mark's posture. His shoulders tensed ever so slightly, and his smile faded. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not on live TV. Still, she reminded herself to stay respectful. This wasn't about attacking him personally. It was about sparking a real conversation that resonated with everyday people. As the segment progressed, Jimmy skillfully bounced between the two guests, keeping the dialogue lively and engaging. At times, Mark responded to Karoline's critiques with thoughtful explanations, defending his policies with data and logic. Other times, he seemed caught off guard, struggling to counter her relatable arguments without sounding condescending. Meanwhile, Karoline held her ground, balancing wit and insight in a way that kept the audience firmly on her side. By the halfway point, the dynamic on stage had shifted noticeably. What had started as a friendly discussion now carried an undercurrent of tension. Mark's polished answers began to feel defensive, while Karoline's candid remarks grew sharper and more pointed. Yet despite the brewing unease, the audience remained captivated, hanging on every word. Little did anyone know the real drama was yet to come. The tension on stage was starting to simmer, and you could feel it in the air. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the master of reading a room, kept things moving with his quick wit. But even he couldn't ignore the growing friction between Karoline and Mark. Carney. The audience, sensing the shift, leaned forward in their seats, eager to see how this unexpected showdown would unfold. What had started as a lighthearted discussion about economics was quickly turning into something more intense. Karoline, still seated calmly beside Mark, wasn't backing down. She knew she was stepping into tricky territory, but she also believed that real conversations required honesty, even if it made people uncomfortable. When Jimmy turned to her again for a response to one of Mark's polished explanations, she didn't hesitate. "I hear what you're saying," she said, her tone polite but firm. "And I don't doubt that these policies look good on paper. But when we talk about helping everyday people, I think we need to ask ourselves, are they actually working? Or are they just benefiting the folks at the top?" Her words hit like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples through the conversation. The audience murmured in agreement, nodding along as if they'd been waiting for someone to say exactly that. Mark shifted slightly in his seat, his jaw tightening. He clearly wasn't used to being questioned so directly, especially not by someone who didn't share his background or credentials. Still, he tried to maintain his composure, responding with another well-rehearsed answer filled with technical jargon about GDP growth and fiscal responsibility. But Karoline wasn't about to let him off the hook. "Let me put it this way," she interjected, leaning forward with a smile that was equal parts charm and challenge. "If your policies were a restaurant, they'd be serving 5-star meals to the VIP section while everyone else is stuck eating leftovers. And honestly, most of us aren't even getting a seat at the table." The crowd erupted into applause, some people even cheering loudly. Jimmy laughed, clearly enjoying the banter. "Ooh, burn," he joked, pretending to fan himself. "That's gotta sting." For a moment it seemed like Mark might laugh it off too, but instead his expression hardened. He glanced at Karoline, then back at Jimmy, and took a deep breath before speaking. "I understand the frustration," he began, his voice measured but tinged with irritation. "But governing an economy isn't as simple as writing a blog post. These decisions require careful analysis and long-term planning. It's easy to criticize from the sidelines, but implementing solutions is far more complicated." The comment landed with a thud. While Mark's point was valid, his tone came across as dismissive, almost condescending. Karoline raised an eyebrow, her smile fading just enough to signal she wasn't intimidated. "You're absolutely right," she replied smoothly. "It is complicated. But here's the thing. People don't care about complexity. They care about results. And if all they're seeing is rising costs and stagnant wages, then maybe it's time to rethink the approach." The audience burst into applause again, louder this time. Mark's face flushed slightly, and he adjusted his tie, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that betrayed his discomfort. Jimmy, sensing the moment needed a bit of levity, jumped in with another joke. Okay, let's take a break before someone starts throwing graphs at each other," he teased, earning a few chuckles. But the tension remained palpable as the segment continued. Karoline pressed on, zeroing in on specific examples where she felt Mark's policies fell short. She cited data from her blog post, pointing out disparities in wealth distribution and questioning whether certain initiatives truly benefited the average person. Each critique was delivered with a mix of humor and precision, making it impossible for Mark to brush her off entirely. At one point she quipped, "If I handed out report cards based on economic fairness, I'm not sure you'd pass." The line drew another wave of laughter from the audience, but Mark's patience was wearing thin. His responses became shorter, sharper, and less diplomatic. Instead of engaging with Karoline's points, he began deflecting, accusing her of oversimplifying complex issues and lacking the expertise to fully grasp the nuances of global economics. With respect, he said, his tone clipped, "You can't reduce decades of policy work to a few clever analogies. This isn't a game." For the first time that evening, Karoline's confidence wavered. She hesitated, unsure whether to push back or dial it down. But then she remembered why she was there. Not to prove herself smarter than anyone, but to give a voice to those who often felt unheard. Taking a deep breath, she looked directly at Mark and spoke softly but firmly. "You're right," she admitted. "This isn't a game. For millions of people, it's their lives. And if my analogies help them understand what's happening and hold leaders accountable, then maybe simplifying isn't such a bad thing after all." The audience erupted once more, this time with sustained applause that seemed to fill every corner of the studio. Even Jimmy looked impressed, giving Karoline an approving nod. Mark, however, sat quietly, his lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, it felt like the tension might ease, like he might concede the point and move on. But then something snapped. "This is absurd," Mark muttered under his breath, though the microphone picked it up clearly enough for everyone to hear. Before anyone could react, he stood abruptly, smoothing his suit jacket with visible agitation. Without another word, he turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a stunned host, a shocked guest, and an utterly bewildered audience. For several seconds, no one moved. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the studio lights overhead. Then, as if waking from a trance, Jimmy broke the ice with a nervous laugh. "Well, I guess that's one way to end a debate," he said, gesturing toward the empty chair where Mark had been sitting moments earlier. The audience, still processing what had just happened, erupted into cheers and applause, many of them whistling and clapping wildly. Karoline, wide-eyed and speechless, stared at the spot where Mark had disappeared. She hadn't expected things to escalate so dramatically, and for a brief moment she wondered if she'd gone too far. But as the reality sank in, that she, a small-town librarian, had just held her ground against one of the most powerful economists in the world, she couldn't help but smile. Whatever happened next, she knew this moment would stay with her forever. The studio was buzzing with energy after Mark Carney's abrupt exit. It wasn't the kind of controlled chaos you'd expect during a live taping. It was raw, unfiltered, and electric. The audience couldn't stop clapping, their cheers echoing through the space like they'd just witnessed history in the making. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the professional, leaned back in his chair with a playful grin, clearly relishing the absurdity of what had just unfolded. "Well," he said, breaking the spell, "I guess we found out who doesn't handle criticism well." His comment drew another wave of laughter from the crowd, easing some of the tension. Karoline, still seated beside him, looked both stunned and amused. She glanced at the empty chair where Mark had been sitting moments ago, then back at Jimmy. I don't even know what to say," she admitted, her voice tinged with disbelief. "That definitely wasn't how I thought this would go." Her honesty only made the audience love her more, and they responded with enthusiastic applause. Jimmy nodded sympathetically, leaning toward her as if sharing a private joke. "Honestly, Karoline, you handled that better than anyone could have expected," he said warmly. "You didn't just hold your ground, you stood up for regular people who might not always get a voice in these kinds of conversations. And let's be real, it takes guts to challenge someone like that on national TV." Her cheeks flushed at the compliment, but she shrugged modestly. "I wasn't trying to embarrass him or myself for that matter. I just wanted to ask questions that maybe other people are too afraid to bring up. If my blog has taught me anything, it's that people appreciate when complicated stuff gets broken down in a way they can actually understand." Jimmy nodded again, turning briefly to address the audience. "Let's hear it one more time for Karoline, folks. She came here tonight, ready to talk economics, and instead, she ended up stealing the show." The crowd erupted once more, cheering wildly as Karoline waved awkwardly, still processing everything. She felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her: pride, shock, and maybe even a little guilt over how things had escalated. But beneath it all, there was also a sense of satisfaction. For years, she'd written about big issues from her tiny corner of the world, hoping someone would listen. Tonight, millions of people were listening and agreeing with her. As the segment wrapped up, Jimmy thanked Karoline for joining him and joked about inviting her back soon. "Maybe next time we'll find someone who can stick around for the whole interview," he teased, earning another round of laughs. Karoline smiled gratefully, shaking his hand before standing up to leave the stage. As she walked off, the applause followed her every step, making her feel like she was floating rather than walking. Backstage, the atmosphere was surreal. Crew members patted her on the back, congratulating her on a job well done. Someone handed her a bottle of water, and she took a long sip, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced with thoughts about what had just happened. Had she crossed a line? Would people think she was too harsh? Or would they see her intentions to spark meaningful dialogue for what they truly were? Her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket, lighting up with notifications from friends, family, and followers back home. Messages poured in faster than she could read them, each one filled with excitement and support. "Did you see that? You crushed it. OMG, I'm so proud of you. This is going viral. Everyone's talking about it." Scrolling through the comments, she saw memes popping up already. Screenshots of Mark storming off, captioned with phrases like, "When someone tells you the truth," or "Plot twist, librarians are secretly superheroes." Despite the whirlwind of attention, Karoline couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. By morning, the internet was ablaze with reactions. Clips of the showdown dominated social media feeds, news outlets, and entertainment blogs. Headlines ranged from playful, "Librarian versus Prime Minister, who won?" to analytical, "Why Karoline Leavitt's words resonated with millions." Comment sections were flooded with praise for her poise and wit, though there were inevitably a few critics accusing her of being disrespectful or uninformed. Still, the overwhelming response was positive, with many applauding her courage to speak truth to power. For Karoline, the sudden fame was overwhelming but humbling. Within hours, her blog traffic skyrocketed, crashing her website temporarily. Due to the influx of visitors, interview requests poured in from major networks, podcasts, and magazines, all eager to hear more from the librarian who took down a PM. Strangers stopped her on the street asking for selfies and thanking her for saying what they'd been thinking but couldn't articulate. It was surreal, but she tried to stay grounded, reminding herself that none of this changed who she was. At her core, amid the chaos, she took time to reflect on what had happened. Yes, Mark Carney had walked off the stage, but she didn't see it as a personal victory. Instead, she viewed it as a reminder of how powerful ordinary voices could be when given a platform. She knew she wasn't an expert, not in the traditional sense, but she believed deeply in the value of simplifying complex ideas and holding leaders accountable. That belief had carried her through the night, and it would continue to guide her moving forward. A few days later, as life began to settle into a new normal, Karoline returned to her library job. Walking through the familiar aisles, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. People often underestimated librarians, dismissing them as quiet bookkeepers content to fade into the background. But Karoline knew better now. Librarians, and everyday people everywhere, had stories to tell, insights to share, and truths to uncover. All they needed was a chance to speak, and speak she would. The whirlwind of attention didn't slow down anytime soon. In fact, it only grew stronger as days turned into weeks. Karoline found herself at the center of a media storm, with interview requests coming in faster than she could respond to them. Morning shows wanted her take on economics. Late-night hosts begged for her witty analogies. Even podcasters who had never cared about fiscal policy before were suddenly clamoring to have her on their programs. At first, she tried to keep up, juggling interviews between shifts at the library and late-night calls from journalists across different time zones. But eventually, she realized she couldn't do it all. She started turning down appearances, focusing instead on what mattered most, staying true to herself. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of returned books, Karoline paused to check her phone. A notification popped up. A clip of her appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live had reached over 50 million views online. She stared at the screen for a moment, shaking her head in disbelief. 50 million, she whispered to herself, half laughing, at the absurdity of it all. Just months ago, her blog post barely got a few hundred clicks. Now people around the globe were watching her challenge one of the most powerful economists in the world. It was surreal, but it also came with its own set of challenges. Not everyone was thrilled about her newfound fame. Some critics argued that she had been too harsh on Mark Carney, accusing her of grandstanding or oversimplifying serious issues. Others dismissed her entirely, saying she lacked the credentials to weigh in on such complex topics. While the negative comments stung, Karoline refused to let them get under her skin. Instead, she leaned on the support of her friends, family, and growing fan base, many of whom reminded her why she'd spoken up in the first place. "You're giving us a voice," one message read. "Don't stop now." Determined to keep moving forward, Karoline decided to use her platform wisely. She began writing more frequently, tackling not just economics but other big-picture issues like education reform, healthcare access, and climate change. Her style remained the same, clear, relatable, and laced with humor, but her focus shifted toward actionable solutions. She wasn't content to simply point out problems anymore. She wanted to inspire people to think critically and demand better from their leaders. Her efforts paid off. Publishers started reaching out, offering book deals and partnerships. After much deliberation, Karoline signed with a small independent press to write a collection of essays titled Everyday Voices, Breaking Down Big Ideas. The title summed up everything she stood for: ordinary people challenging the status quo, asking tough questions, and refusing to be silenced. Writing the book gave her a chance to dive deeper into the topics she cared about, weaving personal stories with broader societal insights. By the time it hit shelves 6 months later, anticipation was high, and it quickly climbed bestseller lists. But success didn't change Karoline. Not really. Despite the offers to move to bigger cities or quit her job at the library, she stayed put in her small New Hampshire town. For her, the library wasn't just a workplace. It was home. It was where she'd discovered her love for storytelling, where she'd spent countless hours helping others find answers, and where she felt most connected to her community. Leaving would have felt like abandoning a part of herself. That's not to say life went back to normal. Far from it. Strangers still recognized her when she ran errands, stopping her to thank her or share their thoughts. Kids at school started calling her the famous librarian, giggling whenever they saw her shelving books. Even her coworkers teased her relentlessly, though always affectionately. "Next time you go on TV, can we come with you?" one of them joked during lunch break. Karoline laughed along, grateful for the camaraderie. What surprised her most, though, was how much she learned from the experience. Before appearing on Jimmy Kimmel Live, she doubted whether her voice mattered. She'd worried that no one would listen to someone without fancy degrees or prestigious titles. But seeing the impact of her words, how they resonated with millions of people, proved her wrong. It taught her that expertise isn't defined by credentials alone. Sometimes it's about perspective, empathy, and the courage to speak your truth, even when you're scared. As the months passed, Karoline began receiving messages from unlikely places. Teachers used her blog posts in classrooms to explain economics to students. Community organizers cited her work during debates about local policies. Even some politicians praised her ability to make complicated issues accessible. One letter, in particular, stood out. It came from a young woman who wrote, "I've always been interested in politics and economics, but I thought I wasn't smart enough to understand them. Your blog changed that for me. Thank you for showing me that my voice matters too." Reading. Those words brought tears to Karoline's eyes. That was exactly what she'd hoped to achieve, not fame or fortune, but a sense of empowerment for others. She knew she couldn't solve every problem or fix every broken system, but if she could inspire even a handful of people to believe in themselves, then it was worth it. Looking back, Karoline realized that her journey hadn't been about proving anything to anyone, not to Mark Carney, not to critics, and certainly not to herself. It had been about connection, about finding common ground with people who felt just as confused, frustrated, or overlooked as she sometimes did, and about reminding everyone, including herself, that ordinary voices have extraordinary power when given the chance to be heard. Quiet evenings after a long day at the library, Karoline would sit at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and open her laptop. The blinking cursor on the blank page seemed less intimidating now. She knew there was still so much to say. So many stories left to tell. So she typed one word at a time, knowing that somewhere out there someone was waiting to read them. Karoline's life had transformed in ways she never could have predicted. But amidst all the chaos and excitement, she remained deeply aware of her roots. The small-town librarian who once doubted her place in the world now found herself balancing two very different roles. The quiet, book-loving woman who helped kids pick out stories and the public figure whose words reached millions. It was a strange duality, but one she embraced with grace. She often joked to herself that her mornings were spent shelving picture books, while her afternoons were filled with emails from producers and publishers. Yet, somehow, it worked. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled outside the library windows, Karoline received an invitation that made her pause. A local community center was hosting a town hall meeting about economic recovery, a topic close to her heart, and they wanted her to speak. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something she'd ever imagined doing regularly, and the thought of standing in front of her neighbors, many of whom had watched her rise to fame, felt daunting. But then she remembered why she started blogging in the first place: to help people understand the issues affecting their lives. With a deep breath, she accepted the invitation. The night of the event, the community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room, each one occupied by familiar faces: friends, colleagues, parents of children she'd helped at the library. There were also strangers, folks from neighboring towns who had driven miles just to hear her speak. As Karoline stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone to her height, she felt a wave of nerves wash over her. But when she looked out at the crowd, she saw warmth and curiosity in their eyes. They weren't there to judge. They were there to learn. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I'm not here to lecture or pretend I have all the answers. What I want to do is start a conversation, a real one, about how we can work together to build stronger communities." She paused, letting her words sink in before launching into her talk. Drawing on her experiences, from her viral blog post to her infamous appearance on Jimmy Kimmel Live, she shared practical advice mixed with personal anecdotes. She talked about the importance of listening to everyday people, of breaking down barriers between experts and ordinary citizens. And yes, she threw in a few jokes too, earning chuckles from the audience. When she finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. People lined up afterward to ask questions or simply thank her for showing up. One older man approached her with tears in his eyes. "For years, I've felt like no one cared what people like me think," he said. "But hearing you tonight reminded me that our voices matter. Thank you for that." Karoline felt a lump rise in her throat. Moments like these, the raw, unfiltered connections, were what kept her grounded. As weeks turned into months, Karoline continued finding new ways to give back to her community. She partnered with local schools to teach financial literacy workshops, using simple language and relatable examples to explain concepts like budgeting and saving. She collaborated with fellow librarians to create resource guides for families struggling during uncertain times. And she used her growing platform to shine a light on grassroots organizations working tirelessly to make a difference. Her message was always the same: change starts with ordinary people taking small, meaningful steps. Despite her busy schedule, Karoline made time for reflection. On weekends, she'd take long walks through the woods near her home, letting the stillness clear her mind. During those quiet moments, she thought about how far she'd come, not just professionally, but personally. She had learned to embrace vulnerability, to trust her instincts, and to lean on others when things got tough. Most importantly, she had discovered the power of authenticity. Being herself, quirks, humor, and all, had resonated with people in ways she never imagined. Her journey wasn't without its challenges, though. Fame brought complications, including occasional criticism from those who disagreed with her views or resented her success. Some accused her of seeking attention, while others dismissed her contributions as fleeting. But Karoline refused to let negativity define her. Instead, she focused on the positives: the friendships she'd forged, the lives she'd touched, and the ripple effect of her actions. Every email from someone saying, "You inspired me to speak up," reinforced her belief that even the smallest efforts could spark big changes. By the following summer, Karoline's influence had spread beyond her hometown. She was invited to speak at conferences, universities, and nonprofit events across the country. Each appearance was an opportunity to share her story and encourage others to find their own voices. Her talks became less about economics and more about empowerment, about believing in yourself even when the odds feel stacked against you. Audiences responded enthusiastically, drawn to her sincerity and relatability. Through it all, Karoline stayed true to her core values. She rejected lucrative offers that didn't align with her mission and turned down opportunities that would have required her to compromise her integrity. Instead, she poured her energy into projects that mattered most, amplifying underrepresented voices, advocating for education reform, and promoting accessible resources for underserved communities. She knew she couldn't tackle every issue alone, but she believed fervently in the power of collective action. Looking ahead, Karoline envisioned a future where ordinary people played a greater role in shaping policies and decisions. She dreamed of a world where leaders listened more than they lectured, where expertise wasn't confined to boardrooms or academic circles, and where everyone, regardless of background, felt empowered to contribute. It was a lofty goal, but one she pursued with unwavering determination. On the surface, Karoline's life might have seemed extraordinary. After all, how many small-town librarians end up challenging prime ministers on national television? But, at its heart, her story was beautifully ordinary. It was about finding courage in unexpected places, building bridges instead of walls, and proving that even the quietest voices can echo loudly when given a chance. And as she sat at her kitchen table late one evening, typing another blog post, she smiled knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the months rolled on, Karoline's life settled into a rhythm that balanced her newfound fame with the comforting familiarity of her small-town roots. She still worked at the library, helping kids pick out books and recommending novels to curious readers. But now she also carved out time for speaking engagements, writing projects, and community initiatives. It wasn't always easy juggling both worlds, but Karoline thrived in the mix of ordinary and extraordinary. Her days were full, but they felt purposeful, and that made all the difference. One chilly November morning, as the first hints of winter crept into the air, Karoline received an email that stopped her in her tracks. A major nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting economic literacy had nominated her for a prestigious award recognizing individuals who use their platform to drive positive change. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Me? Really? She muttered under her breath, staring at the screen. But as she read through the details, her disbelief gave way to gratitude. The nomination wasn't just about her. It was about the movement she represented. The idea that anyone, no matter their background, could make a difference. The ceremony was held in New York City, a place Karoline had visited only once before during a family vacation years ago. Walking through Times Square on her way to the event, she marveled at the towering billboards and bustling crowds. It was a far cry from the quiet streets of her hometown, and for a moment, she felt like she'd stepped into another universe. Still, she reminded herself why she was there: to celebrate the power of collective action and inspire others to keep pushing forward. When her name was called to accept the award, Karoline walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. Clutching the trophy, a sleek crystal sculpture etched with the words, "Champion of Change," she took a deep breath and looked out at the sea of faces. There were activists, educators, policymakers, and everyday people who had fought tirelessly for causes close to their hearts. Standing among them, Karoline felt humbled yet invigorated. "I never imagined I'd be here tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "I'm not an economist, a politician, or even someone who set out to change the world. I'm just a librarian who loves books, believes in people, and wants to make complicated things easier to understand." The audience chuckled softly, nodding along as she continued. "But if there's one thing I've learned over the past year, it's this. You don't have to be extraordinary to create change. Sometimes all it takes is showing up, speaking your truth, and reminding others that their voices matter too." Her speech struck a chord, earning a standing ovation that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, strangers approached her to share their own stories of struggles overcome, dreams pursued, and battles won. Each conversation reinforced what Karoline already knew. Real progress happens when people come together, listen to each other, and refuse to give up. Back home, life returned to its familiar cadence. The library became her sanctuary once again, a place where she could recharge after whirlwind trips and media appearances. Yet something had shifted. Karoline carried herself with a quiet confidence now, rooted in the knowledge that she had made an impact, not because of any title or accolade, but because she had stayed true to her values. People noticed the change, often commenting on how inspiring it was to see someone so grounded amidst the chaos of fame. One afternoon, while sorting through a donation box filled with old books, Karoline stumbled upon a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Flipping through its yellowed pages, she paused at a quote she hadn't thought about in years. "Real courage is knowing you're licked before you begin, but beginning anyway." Those words resonated deeply with her. She realized that every step she'd taken, from hitting publish on her first blog post to walking onto that stage in Los Angeles, had required courage. Courage to speak up, to challenge authority, and to believe in herself when doubt loomed large. Inspired by the reminder, Karoline decided to launch a new project, a podcast called Everyday Voices. The idea came to her during a late-night brainstorming session, fueled by chamomile tea and a notebook full of scribbled ideas. The goal was simple: to amplify the stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. From teachers transforming classrooms to volunteers feeding the hungry, each episode would highlight someone making a difference in their corner of the world. It was her way of saying thank you to everyone who had supported her journey, while encouraging others to find their own paths. Recording the first episode felt surreal. Sitting in her cozy living room with a microphone propped up on her coffee table, Karoline introduced herself and explained the mission behind the podcast. "This isn't about me," she said, leaning closer to the mic. "It's about us, all of us working together to build a better future. Because when we lift each other up, amazing things happen." The response was overwhelming. Within days, listeners flooded her inbox with messages of support and suggestions for future guests. As the podcast gained traction, Karoline found herself connecting with people she might never have met otherwise. She interviewed a farmer who grew food for local shelters, a teenager advocating for mental health awareness, and a retired firefighter volunteering at animal rescue centers. Each story reminded her of the goodness in humanity, reigniting her faith in the power of community. And with every episode, her audience grew, not just locally, but globally. Despite her growing influence, Karoline remained committed to staying grounded. She turned down lucrative sponsorship deals that didn't align with her values and resisted the pressure to chase trends. Instead, she focused on creating content that mattered, fostering genuine connections, and empowering others to take action. Her approach earned her respect not just as a public figure, but as a person who genuinely cared about making the world a better place. Looking back on everything she'd experienced, Karoline couldn't help but smile. Life had thrown her curveballs she never saw coming, but each challenge had taught her something valuable. She had learned to embrace uncertainty, trust her instincts, and lean on the people around her. Most importantly, she had discovered that her voice, her unique perspective, had the power to inspire change. On quiet evenings, as snowflakes drifted lazily outside her window, Karoline would sit by the fire with a cup of tea, reflecting on her journey. She thought about the shy librarian she used to be, hesitant to share her thoughts with the world, and she thought about the woman she'd become, someone unafraid to stand up for what she believed in, even when it meant facing criticism or stepping out of her comfort zone. Both versions of herself were equally important, she realized. Without the doubts and fears, she wouldn't have appreciated the triumphs and joys nearly as much. And so Karoline kept moving forward, one blog post, one podcast episode, one conversation at a time. She knew there was still work to be done, challenges to face, and stories to tell. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Together, with the support of her community and the countless strangers-turned-friends she'd met along the way, she was ready to tackle whatever came next. Because at the end of the day, her story wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who dared to believe in the power of ordinary voices.